You have your lesson sheets, open those to lesson 16. We've been using this series of studies talking about the King David and talking about how he became a man after God's own heart. It's interesting, though, he's not necessarily the whole focus within the lessons, because we have this conversation about Saul in this contrasting kind of mode where we talk about him a little bit as it relates to why it is he kind of faltered from his relationship with God, and contrasting him to David. And that's been our efforts. This is actually going to be the last lesson that we do in this series. We'll move to something else after the gospel meeting. But I want to do one more lesson, just kind of, it was an odd kind of circumstance with Mo here last week, or Sunday, and taking the Bible class time. Then we've got tonight, and we've got the meeting, and so it just seems like we'll do one more lesson, and then we'll start something new when we come in, Lord willing, then on Sunday the 19th. And in this particular lesson, we're going to talk about basically, finally, it's over, right? We've been going through the history, and basically all this time, what's Saul been doing? All right, he's been chasing David down every chance he can get. He's been trying to take care of David in that fashion. And what's interesting is, while he's occupied trying to deal with David, what's he ignoring? Now, he's ignoring God all along, but who else? Philistines. He's ignoring the real enemy. And sometimes you can become so preoccupied with something that has just become an obsession to him that he's ignoring the real problems that are all around him, and his demise is imminent at the juncture of the history that we're examining this evening. And you're going to find that in 1 Samuel chapter 31. So if you want to grab your Bibles, open it to 1 Samuel chapter 31. This is that piece of the historical moment where Saul finally is killed in battle, in essence. And it's interesting because throughout all this time, David's been patient, right? Had David had opportunities to kind of hasten this process? Yeah, he'd had several opportunities where he was in very close proximity to David. Could have just taken matters into his own hands and taken David's life, or Saul's life, and been done and moved on into the kingdom. But David always respected the fact that Saul was what? God's anointed. He never disrespected Saul. I mean, you might challenge that a little bit when he takes his garment or something. But for the most part, he respects Saul, even though Saul didn't have any respect for David. That's a great message, by the way, that I don't know that we've talked a lot about. That sometimes respect is given simply because somebody sits in the position of authority. And that's an important lesson, I think, maybe even culturally today, for us to appreciate. It doesn't mean you agree with everything that... David didn't agree with everything Saul did. David didn't agree with the conduct of Saul. I'm sure that David would have much preferred that Saul go deal with the Philistines and the other issues of the nation and let him be. But at the end of the day, even as evil as Saul had gotten, David says, I'm not taking matters into my own hands. I'm not going to slay him. He is God's anointed, and until God determines by whatever path of His choosing to bring the end of Saul's reign, I will leave it at that. And I've always found that to be a fascinating aspect of David's character as a man after God's own heart, that every inclination would have pointed him in an opposite direction. Every inclination that most men would have had, especially when opportunity presented itself for him to just get rid of Saul, a lot of men, especially those in positions of power, would have just done that. But not David. And so finally, after all this time and all these events and all these things had occurred, you finally come to 1 Samuel chapter 31. And Saul's in battle, and things aren't going well. And Saul loses his life. Now the Philistines fought against Israel, and the men of Israel fled from before the Philistines. This is 1 Samuel 31:1. And fell down slain in Mount Gilboa. The Philistines followed hard upon Saul and upon his sons. And the Philistines slew Jonathan and Abinadab and Melchishah, Saul's sons. And the battle went sore against Saul, and the archers hit him, and he was sore wounded of the archers. And then said Saul unto his armor-bearer, Draw thy sword, and thrust me through therewith, lest these uncircumcised come and thrust me through and abuse me. But his armor-bearer would not, for he was sore afraid. Therefore Saul took a sword and fell upon it. And so here you have, kind of this very sad ending, if you will, of the life of Saul and this first king over Israel and all of the things that go around with it. But while he's pursuing David, he's forgetting that there's a much greater enemy. And that enemy has now won. And his fear of even falling into their hands escalates to where he's willing to ask his armor-bearer to take care of this for him so that he doesn't have to deal with those things. It's an amazing picture when you think about it. If you run over to the questions that were asked, he said, what was the ultimate cause of King Saul's downfall? And how would you classify it? What ultimately brought him down? Okay, I heard that out of several voices tonight. That was a major issue with Saul. His pride always seemed to point him in the wrong directions. And though the Philistines are the army that is pursuing Saul, Philistine is the instrument that God ultimately, if you will, uses to bring the end of Saul's reign. It's Saul's pride that led him there. And it's really kind of sad to see this once great king relegated to this situation.
Okay, you pointed out this direction here a moment ago. Pride was the original, was his downfall because he's so obsessed with getting David.
Yeah.
Because of the pride and his hatred for David. Yeah. So there's two things that cause the downfall. Pride is the first thing.
Yeah. And that pride, did it have fuel? In other words, were there circumstances and things that occurred that kind of fueled his pride and his challenges towards David? What was the pop song of the day? That's right. So I don't know how it went necessarily or what rhythms they used, but the pop song of the day was Saul has killed his thousands, David has slain his tens of thousands, right? And we don't necessarily have how they, but we know that they went through the streets, right? Singing and proclaiming that. David seems to always be one step ahead of Saul. We didn't talk about the fact in some senses as throughout our study that yes, you have these moments of where David had opportunity to take care of Saul in a cave on one occasion, within a camp on another occasion. And doesn't, but lets Saul know, right? At one point he takes his canteen, if you will, his water container. On another occasion, he takes a piece of his garment and then lets him know once he's out of harm's way. But you think about how that might fuel the anger and pride of Saul. If David was that close to do that to Saul, what's that tell you about Saul also? That he had been close enough to do what he had ultimately been seeking. Can you imagine the frustration level on the side of Saul here when he realizes not just I'm being taunted, if you will, by David, and David was that close to me, but I've been waiting for a moment to be that close to David for all these times, and he just never. His pride is just building and building, and there are lots of scenes that are fueling it. People that seem to come to the aid. Remember the priest, right? David gains his benefit, and Saul gets so angry over that he slays the whole family of them. It's just escalating and escalating with him. Go ahead, Jim.
Well, I think God has left Saul.
Yeah.
That didn't help matters any.
No, certainly not. Run over to Proverbs 16, verse 18. Here's this familiar proverb, right? Pride goeth before destruction, and a haughty spirit before a fall. And you think about everything that's been escalating up to this moment in 1 Samuel chapter 31. And just the destruction that he's been setting himself up for a long time.
Brian, in the 1 John 2 or 3 that talks about the three categories of sin: lust of flesh, lust of the eye, pride of life. Everything can be directed, for lack of a better term, directed back to one of those fundamental challenges.
And often you'll even find that most things even fit all three in one form or another. And you can kind of see Saul in that picture.
Brian,
Yeah, go ahead.
it's no surprise that Saul lost this battle. Because if you read it as it read along, he was not a good leader as it was. He did not have control of his people and his army. And so when David comes along and does that, and that increased, that just hurt his pride that much more and caused more hatred. And now it ends now because he wasn't a good leader of his army.
And that has an accumulative effect that ultimately brings him to this moment. So there were lots of things that challenged him in that fashion. Jump to question 3. I looked at question 2. Be honest with you, I didn't think it fit. I'll be honest with you. I don't know that Saul's circumstance exactly fits any kind of practical discussion there. So just jump to question 3. What was the effect upon Israel of Saul's defeat and death?
They ran when the Philistines took over.
Okay, and so you have really the demoralization of the people, and the people are who? Whose people really ultimately are they? Right, but because of his failed leadership, now the people of God are affected by that. Mind's eye, back to 1 Samuel 8. People come to Samuel, right? And they say, your 2 sons are horrible, right? They're ridiculous. We can't follow them. We need a king like all the other nations. Samuel weeps initially over the idea that he was the one being rejected. What did God tell him? Yeah, and God says, no, it's not you they're rejecting. It's me they're rejecting. And then he gives that list of warnings of what's going to happen when I give you a king and I acquiesce to you, and all of those things are exactly what happens with Saul. But to me, that one of the sad elements of all this is that the people of God have become weakened by the poor leadership and a resistance on Saul's part to be a man after God's own heart like he should. And it's an embarrassment and a demoralizing thing for the people of Israelites to be being defeated by the Philistines, and ultimately that becomes a reflection upon who? God. Let me remind yourself of this basic fact. They weren't all in that region, obviously, believers in Jehovah, but they all had at least a God, and more than likely a multitude of gods that they attributed everything to, right? And if the Philistines are victorious over the Israelites, and the Israelites believed in this Jehovah God that they always talk about, then the implication to a Philistine is that our gods are better or stronger than your God. To me, I kept thinking about the fact then that well, modernize it for a minute. How many times when different tragedies or difficulties occur, and the unbeliever will point to the believer and say, "Where was your God?" Right? Why? Where was your God during this moment or that moment? Where was your God when this instance or that instance occurred? And I couldn't help but think about this moment here, where obviously the nations round about were going to see the victory of the Philistines and say, that God must not be all that strong over there that those Israelites are following. Did that make it true? No. It didn't, simply because the people failed. and allowed for themselves to find this demoralizing defeat at the hands of the Philistines does not diminish the power of God. And ultimately, He'll bring Himself back into prominence as He addresses various issues as the history continues to unfold. But simply because the path of choice among men leads them to some consequence, and somebody argues, well, weren't they believers? Why didn't their God do this or do that? It doesn't always work that way. And it's never always worked that way. God has permitted the course of history to unfold sometimes, and bad things happen to His people here because of Saul's poor leadership, because of their willingness to follow him, because of some of their own choosing through all this, and not honoring the commands of God at times. And it brought their destruction. And it doesn't diminish who God is at all.
Let's see. Psychological warfare of an enemy. They beheaded him. They showed the head around their people, They put his armor in the temple, which they're saying by doing that they owe the victory to their God. They hang him on a wall so it can demoralize the Israelites. So that they're using psychological warfare in addition to the fact that they have won the battle.
And of course, by the way, that was done by just about everybody in that time. I mean, they did it with Goliath. The Israelites did it. You know what I mean? So you're right. That mode. I was going to sneeze. That mode has been used by several. I'm going to wait, maybe. Including the Israelites at times. And it's a methodology, if you will, of trying to gain a superiority. And the idea of demoralizing somebody is to take the what out of them? Take the fight out of them, right? The idea of trying to demoralize somebody is that if you weaken them in that sense, then they will not have the passion to fight. And what more demoralizing moment could there have been for the Philistines when their great giant warrior went down? But now that has reversed, and the great king of the Israelites is being used in such a way to try to weaken his people. And then you're going to have some infighting among the nation about who should rule, which isn't going to help them for the first little while either.
But at times you can see, as you said, God manifesting His power in the nations for that very reason, to show Himself as God. I go back to when the Israelites had sinned and God had told Moses, stand aside, let me destroy them, and I'll start over again with you. And Moses' intercession was, well, what will happen to your name? Yeah. You delivered the people of Israel out of Egypt. If you do this now, what will the world think? And I go back to Hezekiah when Judah was surrounded by the Syrians, and he says, the captain of the guard sent a letter to the Israelites saying, don't let Hezekiah fool you. We've conquered all kinds of nations and all kinds of gods, and we're going to destroy you too. And Hezekiah prayed and said, God, you hear these words, but they don't know you. Yeah. And so you see that at times with God demonstrating His power among the nations for that very reason, because it's His name.
And it's a hard concept because we for lack of a better description, we try to humanize God. And God, in some senses, doesn't view success and failure in the same fashion that humans do. And God at times has to allow for what appears to be a failure in order to move to the next moment where He can re-energize His cause and His purpose. And that's a hard concept for us sometimes. And the truth is, John, I think that not to cast a kind of a oversimplified view of people, but if I'm determined to be an unbeliever, I can find ways to continue to be such, and I can take moments like this and see what kind of God could He be if he couldn't even win a victory over the Philistines, or what kind of God can He be if He let this tragedy or this moment occur. And there will always be folks who try to latch on to the things like that, that lead them to unbelief and continue to leave them in that thought process. I think maybe that's why the parable of the sower talks about the kind of heart that's receptive to the message and is desires to be a believer. And it's amazing how just the perspective can influence how we view even Scripture. And that's a challenge sometimes. Go ahead, Roger.
Just a few chapters back, Saul was warned from God that your kingdom will not remain. But He didn't say how it was going to end. So we now seem surprised that the Philistines have regrouped in order to defeat Him. We don't understand God's plan. Just alluded to that. And so I'm not really surprised that God chose this manner.
Right.
Well, God will use human choice to accomplish His purposes no matter what.
Yeah. And that's kind of the enormity of God is that He's able to look out ahead and without necessarily having to force it to happen, can look out ahead and know the character of men and know how the scene will unfold and use that to fulfill the directions and purposes that He has.
He uses, like Roger and John was saying, the human events that took place for His own plan. I mean, this brought everything about what He was wanting to bring about. Everything felt God set this up for it to happen this way, could have been. But He got rid of 3 sons of Saul, which only left the one when he only reigned for 200 days or something like that. Very short period of time. And so everything fell into His plan.
Let me add out of this question the second, in moving into the practical conversation about us. What Saul illustrates to us is that we can have an impact on those around us as well. He had an impact on the entire nation. Certainly as king, I would assume you would, right? But the truth is we have an impact on the circumstances that are surrounding us. My choices, my sinful behaviors, my challenges towards God's purpose for me. All of these things can have a direct bearing on others. It doesn't just affect me. Paul wrote Galatians chapter 2, verse 13. He said, "And the other Jews dissembled likewise with him, insomuch that Barnabas also was carried away with their dissimulation." Here's what's interesting. Who's he talking about there? Who's causing that? Peter's causing that. Who's Peter? Wow. You ever thought of just stop and think about that for a minute? Who are the building blocks for the Lord's church? The apostles, right? And Jesus being the chief cornerstone. And yet God even allowed those men who would become the foundation for the building of the Lord's church to be as flawed human beings. Can you imagine how hard it would have been to resist the example of Peter? Here's an apostle, even so much that Barnabas. Now, here's what's interesting. What's this issue about, by the way? Not to insult your child, but from biblical, what's going on? Okay, and particular though, when Peter was just with Gentiles, he was what? Just great, right? That's all great. But when the Jews would come around, Peter would be a little bit hands off, right? And that influenced even Barnabas. What's Barnabas' name mean, by the way? Anybody remember? son of consolation, or also some words would be encourager. Remember, when we think of Barnabas, we think about the man who when Paul was like, John Murray ain't ever setting another step, right? I'm not taking him anywhere. And Barnabas defends, right? Barnabas is the encourager. Barnabas is the son of consolation. Barnabas is the one that you would assume that would be sympathetic to these Gentile converts and want to encourage them, not to push them aside because the Jews happen to show up. But that's how powerful the influence of Peter was. That it even moved Barnabas into a behavior that was inappropriate. And it takes whom? Isn't that interesting? It's Barnabas that comes to the aid of John Mark and says, listen, Paul, it didn't go so well, but I believe in him and I think we can rely upon him. And ultimately says, you go your way and I'll take Mark and we'll go a different direction. And then the role reverses. It's now Paul coming and saying, listen, we can't do this to the Gentiles. This behavior is inappropriate. But to me, the practical, powerful side of that is that's how influence can work. That even a man like Barnabas, a good, solid man, was influenced by the example of Peter. We can have greater influences on circumstances. We don't just sit by ourselves and not have an impact. And we've got to be cautious about that and be mindful of it, and then also be sure that we're watching out for how we're being influenced by these various things. In verse 15 of 1 Peter 4, but let none of you suffer as a murderer, or as a thief, or as an evildoer, or as a busybody in other men's matters. Be careful. Be careful. As you walk through your life, do not get caught up in the behaviors and the temptations and the influences that are around us. Saul led an entire nation down the wrong path. And his demise has come. The nation's going to be in turmoil for a while until David can kind of steer it right. But it's amazing how Saul's darkness kind of envelopes the entire nation for a period of time. Thoughts or questions up to that point? And let me also add that just as that demoralized, as we've been talking about, the sinful behaviors of those who should be faithful to the Lord can be demoralizing to a people. How many times have we've seen circumstances and we just shake our heads and wonder how in the world did somebody who was so faithful, so dedicated, or so knowledgeable, or so zealous in the Lord's work, how is it possible that they made these choices and decided to go down these paths? And it can be quite discouraging to us as individuals. It can be discouraging to a congregation. It's hard. I've been with congregations in the past who've had to deal with some. You could ask me about it later, but some pretty heavy circumstances, criminal circumstances that would just make you just shake your head, and how demoralizing that could be to people, and how hard it is to build back up after that. And so we need to focus on being people after God's heart continually, to be able to raise that encouragement and that influence into positive ways, because there's so much other that seems to want to drag it down. Question 4 says, what is wrong with finding fascination and joy in the downfall of celebrated or powerful people? And Jeff mentions a couple like O.J., and I assume he's referring to Britney Spears there at that point. He probably wrote this. I'm trying to think of what year it was. But anyway, a long time ago, actually. But the point of that is, what was David's reaction to Saul's death? You know, you've all seen The Wizard of Oz, right? And the bucket of water hits her, and she melts, and Dorothy's fear is that those around her will be angry with her, and they do what? They rejoice and celebrate. And generally speaking, that's kind of the mindset some people have. Is that when somebody who was evil or had some kind of negative purpose or something behind them in that fashion, that when you see their demise come, that's something to be celebrated. What I love about David, a man after God's own heart, is he does not see the death of the king as something to be celebrated. Did it bring David maybe a sense of some relief? I'm sure it did, right? Does it bring a flood of all kinds of thoughts? Because really, what's that mean?
He's king.
All this time, I've been saying, in God's time, in God's way, I'll let Saul find his end the way God determines. It's not going to die at my hands. And now it's happened. And now all of a sudden, I'm the king. It's not a time for celebration. Excuse me. It's not a time for celebration. David has a tremendous level of respect for simply the fact that was God's anointed that has died. That is the king that has died. Notice, starting in verse 2 of 2 Samuel 1, came even to pass on the third day. Behold, a man came out of the camp from Saul with his clothes rent, and the earth upon his head. And so it was, when he came to David, that he fell to the earth and did obeisance. David said unto him, From whence comest thou? And he said unto him, Out of the camp of Israel I escaped. David said unto him, How went the matter? I pray thee, tell me. And he answered, That the people are fled from the battle, and many of the people also are fallen and dead. And Saul and Jonathan his son are dead also. To learn of Jonathan's death is going to be difficult too, from a whole different perspective. David said unto the young man that told him, How knowest that thou that Saul and Jonathan his son be dead? And the young man that told him said, As I happened by chance upon Mount Gilboa, behold, Saul leaned upon his spear, and lo, the chariots and horsemen followed after him. When he looked behind him, he saw me, and he called unto me, and I answered, Here am I. And he said unto me, Who art thou? And I answered, I am an Amalekite. And he said unto me again, Stand, I pray thee, upon me, and slay me, for anguish is come upon me, because my life is yet whole in me. So I stood upon him and slew him, because I was sure that he could not live after he was fallen. And I've taken the crown that was upon his head, and the bracelet that was on his arm, and I have brought them hither unto my Lord. By the way, what's this man in hoping, probably? Yeah, that they'll be rewarded because he's the man that finally brought down the demise of Saul. Doesn't work out that way, right? But when David learns of this, they mourned and wept and fasted until evening for Saul and for Jonathan his son. And then notice, and for the people of the Lord and for the house of Israel, because they were fallen by the sword. It took a devastating loss at the hands of the Philistines to ultimately bring the demise of Saul. And what I appreciate about David, this man after God's own heart, is he obviously mourns the death of his friend, Jonathan. He ultimately mourns the death of the king. But he said also, this was a blow to the people. This is a blow to the house of Israel. David's sorrow over this circumstance is a recognition that this whole account, all these years, all the things that have been occurring over this span of time, has never really been about David. David says it's been about whom? It's been about the people. I mourn for the people. That these circumstances brought calamity. I mean, wouldn't it be wonderful to have leadership whose thought processes were the people? Whose the beauty of David's leadership mindset is that his concern is about the people. He's going to have some pretty horrible personal failures as he moves forward in his rule. There are going to be some horrible hardships that he's going to suffer from family circumstances because of the issues surrounding his children. Lots of difficulties and horrible things are coming. But I love the spirit of David here. It's not celebratory time because now I get to be king, which would have been the instinct of a whole lot of folks in leadership and positions of power. But he's more concerned about how bad this is going to be and how hard this is going to be for the people of the Lord, the house of Israel.
Right.
Yep, go ahead.
The story that this Amalekite tells David, which is in conflict to chapter 31, verse 8. But do you feel that David had him killed because of the conflict of the story, or because he slew God's anointed? Said he killed God's anointed.
I believe David's basing his decisions on what the Amalekite told him. And so,
Which would be then
that he actually slew Saul.
He didn't serve the proper respect for Israelites
Yes.
king.
Yes. Yes. Yeah. I think David's reactions here are based on what this man who came thinking he would be rewarded, but finds out he's going to get the opposite of that because he's killed the king by his own admission. Now, does that sound? I've wondered that in my own mind a little bit. Does 1 Samuel 31 just not tell us the whole? You know what I mean? We see up to a point, and then this man kind of fills in the rest for us how the whole thing happened. Did he come upon Saul and find him, and embellishes for his own personal gain? Those are kinds of questions that are hard to kind of. Yeah. He was smart when it came to that.
But this guy brought news, whether it was news that he had killed David, and here you go, you're the king now, or I know that you've been worried about Saul all this time, and in a humane way, he finished him.
Yeah.
I don't know for sure which way he came.
Yeah, and that's why. And the only thing and maybe there's a little bit of reading between the lines here, but I think if David is who I believe he is, from all the narrative and things we've learned about him, his reaction tells me that his conclusion is that this man hoped to gain something by being ultimately the guy who says, I'm the one who actually put Saul to death. And that's what gets him in trouble here. I think if he had simply come to David and said, I found Saul along the way and this is what I witnessed, I don't think this scene plays out the same. It appears that he's trying to gain some kind of benefit from the fact that he wants to claim that he was the one that finally, did Saul in. And that's why David was. And that's just the conclusion I've made just based on the narrative.
I agree with that by verse 14. I was that thou was not afraid to slay the king, the Lord's anointed.
Yeah, and that's an interesting. The hard part about that is what don't we have in that verse?
An
An
answer.
answer. Okay, we don't have his response. Maybe he didn't say anything. I don't know because he kind of just asked the question. Then the very next piece of history we learn is David calls for one of his young men that's with him and says, "Go smite that fellow." But keep reading. Look at verse 16. Not to dredge down this path for too much longer. But David said unto him, Thy blood be upon thy head, for thy mouth hath testified against thee. What he claimed and said is what got him in trouble. And that's why I believe David's thought processes were he believed that this man comes in a victorious mode of I'm the one who finally did end Saul. And that's why he says that that this man in his own words says, I've slain the Lord's anointed. But here's the sorrow and the sadness that comes. And I think that the lesson again for us from that then is when he asks what is wrong with finding fascination and joy in the downfall of celebrated or powerful people. Why would any follower of God want to rejoice in anyone's in anyone's demise. No one's demise should be celebrated. We sometimes we can forget. I suppose we're prone to the same kinds of human thinking that others are, but we forget sometimes we really should be above that as believers in God. To not find any kind of joy or excitement over the death, of the demise, or the downfall of any. We may felt like OJ was as guilty as all get out, but that scene is horrible, right? That whole piece of history is just horrible, and no matter what kinds of outcomes come from some legal process, there's nothing to be celebrated. Sure, had Saul been horrible towards David? Had he not? Was he an evil man in many senses? Yes, all the above. Call him whatever. But there's nothing to be celebrated when the king over Israel has died in battle against the Philistines, and God's name is going to be put into jeopardy because of it. The people are going to be put into jeopardy because of it. There's nothing to celebrate. And maybe there's a little piece of wisdom for us that we don't, and it's easy, right? Because all we got to do is take that little rectangular or rounded shaped controller and juke a button on there, and 24/7 I could sit and watch the demise of people, right? And we've become almost accustomed, so much accustomed to it that what's wrong with us? that we sit and I don't care what the circumstance. If there was a circumstance of evil, then there's some sadness associated with it, and none of it really should be celebrated. And that's a lesson. I'm preaching that to me, by the way, because I can be hooked just like the next guy with the fascination of world and societal events. Yeah.
Probably the saddest thing about this whole thing was that Saul was non-repentant.
Yeah.
Therefore lost his soul.
Yeah. I mean, no evidence whatsoever that he.
Just because somebody.
Yeah.
If justice is served, then more and more happens.
Yeah.
We're really not to be divided in that part because they lost another soul.
Yeah. And I'm okay for justice against evildoers. It's just not something that fits in the celebratory category. When the mere fact that justice had to be served illustrates that there must have been some horrible act that occurred for justice to be needed. And I think that's really, to me, that just kept coming back to me as kind of the lesson within the lesson.
This is a good lesson for all of us.
Yeah, because we've just been programmed in our world to just sit and absorb it. And anyway, and the hard part about that too, Roger, is it has all kinds of negative effects on us. It desensitizes us to what evil does in our world because we're just so used to watching it on a 37 or 42-inch screen all day. It jades us. We want that evildoer. Almost we personalize. I think that there's a reason why the New Testament, particularly Jesus, teaches the idea that repay not evil for evil. It's not personal. Don't seek your own personal vengeance. Let God repay. Those things need to come to the forefront of our minds. Saul's demise was not a celebration day, and David gives us a great example. When evil, even when it's dealt with, I can honor justice being served, respect justice being served, but celebrate. Maybe I need to change my mindset a little bit about that. Question 5. What is God's warning about reveling in your enemy's demise? We've already kind of talked a little bit about this. Let's go over to Proverbs 24. Rejoice not when notice that. Rejoice not when thine enemy falleth, and let not thine heart be glad when he stumbleth, lest the Lord see it and it displease him, and he turn away his wrath. Just stop and ask yourself this question: Have you ever seen somebody finally kind of get their just reward, and we say or think something like, boy, it couldn't have happened to a better person, right? Yeah. And Proverb here kind of warns us about that. And he warns us because he says, lest the Lord watch you gloating over your enemy's failures and stumbling, and turn his attention to you. That's what he said. You know, I sometimes in my own mind, I fear that it's this kind of thing that's going to get a lot of us. Does that make sense to you? That I may not do some great, horrible, heinous, sinful act in my life that just drags me down a sinful path. But it's this kind of thing that God warns me about. That we kind of just brush aside and don't give it a whole lot of thought. But let's be careful. You know, there's nothing to be like. Think about how many times have you seen somebody fall, and what's your first reaction? Especially if they're 18. You laugh. Okay, let's be honest for a minute. Why is it that we find something comical and we almost have to fight the laughter to even ask, are you okay? Correct? You're asking, are you okay, through the... And again, I'm just trying to illustrate it. We need to think that through a little bit. Why are we celebrating the demise or failure or the stumbling? And I realize there's much more weightier matters than just the idea of somebody tripping. But let's be careful. Let's be careful and not get into that mindset.
Hey, Brian,
Yeah, go ahead.
In that respect, wouldn't we be just as guilty of the same sin as Saul in pride and arrogance?
Yeah.
Look at what happened to you, not to me.
Yeah, and in particular to those that we have some issue with. You know, the description here in Proverbs is about your enemies, those that you have some issue with. And you know, we just have to be careful that we don't get into this mindset. Well, you know, serves them right, right? How many times have we said that? Serves them right. If you're talking about justice, maybe, but not necessarily talking about that.
In fact, chapter 17 there, verse 5 of Proverbs, it says about mocking the poor and those, you know, you're showing contempt to God. It won't go unpunished.
And that's the kind of the practical side of all this that we kind of need to appreciate.
Wisdom comes in that the next time that can be us.
Yeah. Yeah. It's not as funny when you're slipping on the ice, is it? It's not nearly as funny. All right.
I like Romans 12, the last 4 verses. Read all that next week.
I appreciate this study. I hope we gain some practical benefits by looking at this history from that angle. And we'll have our gospel meeting. We'll start Sunday, and we'll have that. And then on the 19th, we'll jump into our next study.